Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Program on Education Policy and Governance Colloquium Series. My name is Marty West. I'm on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and it's my pleasure to introduce Jason Cook, who is an assistant professor at the Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah. I first came to know of Jason through his work on the effects of school desegregation on student outcomes. He's done great work in that area. But today he's going to be talking about some brand new work on the effects of teachers' unions on education production. So I think he'll share with us that this is work they're definitely interested in getting substantive feedback on. And so hopefully we can repay him for his time with that service over the course of the next hour. So Jason, thanks for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Marty. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for all of your time as well. I know everyone's very busy and Zoom fatigue is real, so I appreciate your time being here. This is joint work with Stefan Lavertu at Ohio State and with Corbin Miller at the US Treasury. And I know that everybody's time is valuable, so I'm going to just give a slide that goes through the paper. In case you leave early and miss the punchline, you'll get it now. So what we're doing here is we're studying how teachers' unions impact the way that school districts allocate the revenue, and also ultimately what happens with student achievement as a result. We want to know, do more powerful unions affect the way that schools are spending their money, and does that change student achievement? So what we're going to be using, we have 2 decades of Ohio tax referenda, which is how the schools, a majority of the funding comes from property taxes. So we use these data. We have digitized contracts for the universe of union contracts across Ohio that we've done, scraped the text and done analysis with that. And then we have district level achievement, that it's both public use data from the National Center for Education Statistics and also some restricted use data. The design we're using, we have a difference in regression discontinuity design. So the way to think about this, the regression discontinuity part is we are comparing what is the impact of narrowly passing one of these property tax levies on a range of outcomes, how the districts spend their money, what happens in terms of student achievement, things like that. So that's the RD piece, you narrowly pass this property tax levy. And then the difference piece is we compare those outcomes, those changes in districts that we categorize as having more or less union pressure. And I'll make it very clear how we characterize that. And so contrasting those two things lets us say, okay, a district gets a windfall of money, an exogenous shock to their resources. How differently do they spend it with union pressure and without? And then what happens as a result? So to preview our findings, districts that are allocating this new revenue under union pressure, we find that they increase salaries for teachers and increase benefits. They spend down their reserves, so they're in a slightly more, their fiscal situation is a little more dire, and they don't change the staffing. There's no changes in the number of teachers or student-teacher ratios in their schools. And as a result, they don't see any changes in student achievement. So even though they've gotten this surplus of funds, they don't experience any achievement changes. To contrast that, districts that allocate these new funds under less union pressure, they change their work conditions in the contracts themselves. The text relating to work conditions change more. They hire more teachers, which brings down student-teacher ratios. And then as a result, they experience student achievement gains. And so overall, the story is a story that's painting the picture that union pressure is changing the way that schools are spending their money, and in ways that actually might be making it so that student achievement isn't growing as much as it would otherwise.
Jason, I'm trying to interrupt the temptation to interrupt you on your first slide, but just to make it more conversational, I'm going to go ahead and do it anyways. Are you able to distinguish between raising salaries for existing teachers or more veteran teachers and newer teachers, and the relative emphasis on that in the places under union pressure?
Yes, so we have, what we're looking at is we can look at this a few different ways. We have, in addition to what the teachers are actually being paid, and you'd have to pay attention to the composition of the teachers and things. We estimate directly how the union or the collective bargains themselves, the agreements themselves are changing. So we could say a master's level teacher, their salary is increasing, or someone that's entering with a bachelor's, how their salary is changing. It's actually the contract themselves that we're
Okay.
looking at rather than like the composition. So maybe there's a PhD teacher. There's not a lot of PhD teachers, but we could observe that as an outcome and study that. So we can do both. Yeah, great question. Then I should say, please interrupt. I'm used to just to having conversation throughout. So please, I've baked in time for people to interrupt. So please do. Okay, and on this, so comments are definitely welcome. This, like Marty was saying, this is a new paper, and we're underpowered in places, but we think the story that we're telling is important and it's consistent across, even though we are underpowered. So we're receiving some pushback with this project. This paper here, you've probably seen this is a paper in the economics literature that documents in the top journals that there's this kind of gap for papers that are just shy of being statistically significant. Well, we're right in this gap, and we're experiencing the pushback that probably creates this gap. So if there's anybody that has thoughts of or comments of ways to improve our analysis or make it more convincing or anything to strengthen it, we're definitely open to that. But I'll try to be open where we are underpowered. I'll be very upfront about that. Okay, so to motivate this question and why it's important, there's policy experts, academics that have concerns that powerful teachers unions may benefit teachers, but not necessarily students. A recent example is this paper by Hartney and Finger that shows that union strength predicts whether or not a district offers instruction to their students remotely during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is just clearly something that the teachers would value and the unions would value. It just kind of shows how the union strength could be having these impacts. And it's theoretically ambiguous whether or not teachers' unions are going to reduce school efficiency. A lot of it will depend on the goals and expertise and the effort of teachers and district officials. And so it's something that needs to be explored empirically, which is what we do here. It's important to look at this because a majority of teachers are covered by collective bargaining agreements. And so this understanding how these impact the way that teachers or the way that schools operate is really important. And it's also a popular policy lever that's kind of been a target in recent education reforms. So multiple states, including Ohio, which is the context of our study, passed legislation in 2011 to roll back the scope of collective bargaining. There's this landmark case, Janus versus the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, just rolls off your tongue. In 2018, effectively nationalized right to work rules for public sector employees. So right to work is just, you cannot be compelled to join a union or pay union dues. And then this more closely related to the teacher context, this Vergara, California case argued that teacher retention and teacher tenure policies violated California students' constitutional right to a quality education. So I just bring these up to highlight that teachers' unions have been a focus of these reform efforts and is a potential policy lever that could be pulled. And so it's important to understand the implications of teachers' unions in schools. And we have some information on this. There's been some prior research. So in a recent paper, Bruner, Hyman, and Jew find that strong unions are associated with increased district spending and increased student achievement. And then Mike Lovenheim and Alex Willen have a recent paper as well. They look at kind of the longer run effects. They find that the introduction of duty to bargain laws, which just makes it so that districts have to collectively bargain with unions, that shifted spending towards teachers and administrators, and then led to long run decreases in educational attainment and labor market outcomes for men and minorities. And then there's also work that shows that more restrictive collective bargaining agreements are associated with lower student achievements. You kind of show it in both ways. And then Carolyn Huxby has a kind of a classic model that models the bargaining game between teachers and parents. And she shows that the outcome is going to lie somewhere in between what both parties want, which is what you would expect. So we view our paper as a direct test of this rent-seeking theory. Okay, so to start off, we're going to talk about the empirical framework before we go into the data and institutional details, because the setup of the empirical framework is going to frame how we construct the sample and things later on. So we'll start here, and then we'll fill in the details later with the data and the institution that we're going to be considering.
Jason, let me pause you for one more second, which is, unions can affect education production in lots of different ways, right? Through the negotiation of the contract, through participation in the political process, through advocacy at the state level. And I think a lot of those, different potential avenues of impact, it's not obvious that they all need to push in the same direction when it comes to this RENCI. Do you see this analysis as sort of testing one particular avenue, or which I think the answer is yes. But then how should we think about that in relationship to the broader question of, are unions good or bad, which I think is what motivates a lot of this work?
Sure, that's a great question. Yeah, I would say we are isolating a particular part of this. So the aspect we're considering is what happens when the districts have funds to allocate, and what is the role that the teachers unions play in shaping how those funds are spent. And so I think this is going to speak less to the larger kind of political sway that the unions have. This is more, when I have money and there's a union right there watching me, am I spending my money differently? So it's this very, where the rubber is meeting the road, the tire is meeting the road, way that the unions can interact with the districts, and less to this higher, more broad umbrella that you're talking about. I think it's important this is an important aspect of it, though, that I think this is probably one of the larger ways that unions can be shaping the districts, is directly how these collective bargaining agreements are put together, because these bargaining agreements, they effectively control every aspect of the teacher's engagement with schools. So I think it's an important aspect, but I don't think we'll be able to tell you whether or not unions are good or bad. I think there's another interesting layer that we can't say anything about, is that we can't say anything about the strength of the union. You might think that places that have a stronger union versus a weaker union, you might see different things. We're going to be telling you within a given a set strength of a particular union, when you're more or less exposed to that union, how you behave. So I think there's definitely nuances that we won't be able to speak to, but I think we still answer an important question of how an important avenue through which unions affect school districts.
Yeah, you could imagine that the unions play a role in like determining the referenda outcome that you're studying, right? I mean, sure. Through their political activities. And so sure. To the extent that just having those resources in the first place is good, well, you're going to show, yeah. So anyways, just to make it concrete.
And in terms of like internal validity, at least empirically, it doesn't seem like we don't see that you're more likely to observe district narrowly passing the referendum.
Right out, yeah, right at the cutoff, right.
Exactly.
But,
so internal validity, I think we're okay, but your broader point is absolutely true, that the unions could throw their weight around to get a particular levy passed. I think in Ohio's context, it might be a little different as we go into institutional details. Ohio's a little bit funny the way they've set it up. Districts are constantly going to the ballot to get new referenda. So it strikes me as a dimension that might matter a little bit less to the unions to throw their weight on a particular referenda, because these districts will oftentimes have 5 or 6 of these ongoing levies that are passed at a time. And it's just a constant mechanism that they're securing resources. But we can talk more about that when we get to the institutional details, though. These are great points, though.
And Taran, you want to jump in?
Yeah, you might actually get to this a little bit later. My first 2 questions. The first is on the identification strategy. Sure. And so did you see any, I'm sure you looked into this and you'll talk about it, but did you see any important differences across the kinds of districts that did end up implementing, substantial contract changes versus ones that didn't? And like, the plausible exogeneity of that? And then the second question is, did you look at other sort of intermediate outcomes that mediate student achievement apart from just, changes in expenditure? So for example, teacher placement policies across schools, or hiring, firing, or evaluation protocols?
Yeah, so we've looked at, so yeah, so I'll hold on the first part of your question. That's like the next few slides here. We believe it's exogenous, and I'll try to convince you as well. And then the second part of your question was about the intermediate outcomes. So yeah, to the extent we can, we look at how the contracts themselves are changing, which would affect how the teachers are interacting with the schools. It's a little tricky, these contracts. I would love to be able to hire 1,000 students to read these 500-page documents, maybe not 500 pages, 80-page documents, and code them directly. We're a little limited in that way, so that we can tell you how much the text is changing in particular sections, but we weren't able to go in and like code up every single possible way. So I think we'll speak less to the intermediate outcomes than you would prefer, but we are able to speak to some. We're able to say they're maybe making concessions based on work conditions or things like that. We can see teacher evaluation and teacher retention policies broadly. A lot of the action didn't end up being in that area, but it could just be that there wasn't a lot of variation during much of the time frame of this in terms of teacher evaluation. Teacher evaluation was kind of a more recent push in Ohio, kind of at the end of our sample. But you can tell me what you think when we get to the results, though. These are great questions. Okay.
As someone who spent a lot of time digging into union contracts, I understand.
they're painful. It was. We tried to get class sizes, and that was even just really hard to figure out how to extract class sizes information from this. So it's. I mean, Sean Reardon and others have done a lot with these documents, and it's a feat to be working with these as we're learning. Okay, great. So let's dive into the empirical framework, and let's see if I can convince you that we're doing something sensible. So to remind you, this is a difference in regression discontinuity design. So the RD part is we're comparing districts that narrowly pass and narrowly fail to pass a tax levy. And we look at outcomes on collective bargaining agreements, budgeting, student achievement. Okay, so the idea is we're going to be comparing districts that we think are facing more or less union pressure. And we're going to say that tax revenue that's collected through this exogenous process, you narrowly pass a referenda to get extra resources. If you do that right before you're about to go up for collective bargaining, we're going to call you a close district, a close CBA. And if you negotiate if you collect your tax revenue, well before your next scheduled round of negotiations, we'll call you a distant CBA. And so the key things here is that the timing of the referenda relative to the bargaining needs to be random. Otherwise, we're going to be selecting on an endogenous sample, and everything wouldn't be as credible. So there's some reasons to think that this would be the case in Ohio, and I alluded to one of these earlier. So first, districts need to pass these levies all the time in order to keep their revenues up. The levies aren't pegged to inflation, and so and there's a 5-year cutoff. So when you pass one of these levies, it's going to end in 5 years. These districts oftentimes have several of these going on at once. And if you narrowly fail to pass a levy, you're going to put it on the ballot the next year. So a lot of these things, the setup just makes it so these districts are returning to the ballot box very frequently to get these local property taxes passed. And it's very unlikely that they'd be gaming it and timing when they put something on the ballot relative to when their next collective bargaining agreement would be happening, or their collective bargaining session would be happening. And then similarly, so there's 5-year limits for these levies and for the most part, and the collective bargaining agreements, a vast majority of them are on a 3-year set schedule. And so the 5-year and the 3-year schedules just can't consistently align. And so both of those theoretically make it seem like these things shouldn't be moving together. And then we test it empirically, and it also seems to be the case. And I'll show you some evidence of that as well. So here's just another visualization. So we are going to try to isolate variation in bargaining power by making these comparisons between these two types of districts. So the first here is our close collective bargaining districts. These ones are able to put a ballot or put a referenda up for a tax levy between November and June, and then their collective bargaining happens sometime in the summer. Most of the collective bargaining happens in the summer between the school years. So this would be a close district, and then a distant district. They have their scheduled collective bargaining the following summer. So they put it on the ballot at the same time, but then their next scheduled round is further in the future. And so we make some assumptions here that you might be wondering, well, the district or the unions, well, they'll know that you passed a tax referenda, even if it's 2 years ago or a year ago, they know you passed it, and that's true. What we try to argue is that these school districts, they have superior information about their financial situation. And because they have this longer time period before the collective bargaining happens, they're able to commit some of their resources in ways that the funds just aren't available. If you hire a new teacher, you're basically committed to pay them for the life of their contract. And it's very hard to fire these teachers. And so if you hire new teachers, that all the resources that went to that teacher are basically fixed. And now there's less to be bargaining over in the future for the unions. So that's the design, and we'll try to convince you that this is plausibly isolating union strength.
Eric, you want to jump in?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, two questions. One quick one. Are you using just cross-section, a sort of single point in time cross-section, like 1 year, or are you using the sort of panel nature of districts going back for repeated levies?
Right. Yeah, so we will use a district more than once. It's not, a district won't appear one time in the data. We're not doing the kind of Cellini, Ferrer-Rothstein treatment on the treated. We're interested in the contemporaneous effects of these policies. So the intent to treat is okay, that we're after just what happens immediately after you try to pass one of these referenda. But we do use the fact if you go up today and you try again in 4 years or whatever, and you go up again, we'll consider both of those for a district. So it's not just a single cross section, and we'll cluster standard errors on district to try to account for that, the fact that you're appearing multiple times, but we're not doing their design where we're trying to account for the fact that you'll show up again in the future based on what happened in the past, because we are really interested in just this kind of instantaneous, what happens right when you're passing it, rather than the longer run effects.
Right. So there's the sort of econometric features of the Cellini, Ferrer, and Rothstein paper, but there's sort of more sort of a substantive question about, like, I'm curious if this is something that you're concerned about. Like, is my behavior in levy T influenced by the nature or the outcome of, levy T-1? I mean, it seems like there's good reason to think substantively it would be. I don't know if you think econometrically it's something that we.
Yeah, I mean, it's true for sure that if I narrowly fail a referenda, narrowly fail to pass a tax levy, that I may ask a little bit less next time, and then I might try to. And you'll see that most of the votes are right around 50% because they're trying to get the most they can out of the voters without failing. And so that absolutely is going to be true. I think, yeah, I'm less worried about it just in terms of how that affects how we interpret the outcomes or interpret our results, just because empirically it looks like we're not seeing all of the checks that you would want to see for regressionist continuity designs all work out in terms of potential outcomes being smooth across or observables being smooth across the cutoffs and things like that. And I think that if there was a huge problem where what you do now, sorry, so the meeting has ended, but I'm still here. So I think you're all still here too. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So it seems like if there was a big problem in terms of what I do this time is greatly affected by last time, I would think it would show up in some sort of imbalance in these checks. But I don't think that was a great answer to your question. I think I've thought about it more in terms of the econometric side of things rather than the interpretation side. So if you want to follow up or push back, please do. But that's the best answer I can give right now. Okay, great. So here's exactly what we do. It's what you'd expect from a regression difference in regression discontinuity design. We have some flexible way to control for vote, the share of the vote on the particular levy. The regular RD would just be whether or not you pass. So this is for districts that are experiencing more union pressure. This is telling you what's happening right at that cutoff, that jump. And then the difference between districts that are distant versus close is this tau 1. So we'll be showing you a lot of these tau 1 and tau 2 parameters in this paper. We control for baseline student demographics and lagged outcomes just to help reduce residual variation. And then for contract provisions, we're looking at how the text is changing between the current provision and the previous one. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit, so I'll go through this kind of quickly, but we show in the paper, I won't bore you with all of it on here, but we show that there's evidence that we should think that the potential outcomes are smooth through the threshold. We don't see imbalances in terms of pretreatment covariates. There's no manipulation in terms of are there more votes, are there more ballots that are just passing than not. And then we spend a lot of time trying to convince you that the timing of the bargaining, the timing of collective bargaining is exogenous relative to when these referenda are up. So we don't see any observable differences between close and distant districts, which is what you'd expect if it was random. And then there's no relationship between passing the levy and the timing of the next collective bargaining, because you might think, okay, so maybe the districts aren't trying to game when they put something on the ballot relative to the next scheduled round, but maybe it's the unions, they push up, you pass something and they change when you're supposed to be scheduled. We don't see any evidence of that either. And then I'll show you results on this as well, that we find evidence that districts are largely committing their new revenues in the summer after the election. So that the funds are available for those close districts. It's available to be allocated. So when they're doing collective bargaining, they do have the money available. And they're also spending that money right away. So by the time the distant ones comes, there's just less on the table that hasn't been committed to different avenues already. And we show that the bargaining has a different impact on the way money is spent for close and distant districts, even though they're observably similar in other ways. Great. Okay, so now that's the empirical design. And now we're going to spend a few minutes just telling you about the data we're using and then some of the institutional features of Ohio along the way as well. And so there's kind of 3 sections. I'll talk about the contracts, so give you some background about that, the tax referenda, and then schools. Okay, so collective bargaining in Ohio. Ohio is a duty to bargain state. The districts have to negotiate with teachers' unions. These contracts are extremely broad. They touch most aspects of what a teacher would experience in the work setting: salary schedules, benefits, evaluations, job protections, things like that. Most districts are negotiating their contracts every 3 years. And they're staggered. So about a third of there's 600 districts in Ohio, about a third of them are negotiating contracts each year. So this is just showing new collective bargaining agreements by year. You can see it's pretty uniform. In the Great Recession, it looked like things kind of started to get shifted. So we focus our analysis on contracts that are on schedule for their 3 or 4 year rounds here, and not ones that are that have changed for this reason, because it does look like there's this shift. And we've done sensitivity checks where we limit it before the Great Recession and everything looks good. But as you can see, it's a pretty uniform distribution for most of our sample. Okay, so then we have contract data from the Ohio State Employment Relations Board. They gave us a data file that has contract dates, some salary and benefits information that they had an army of people go through and collect, which was nice. And then they also provided us PDF scans of the full contracts for 2 decades of all the different union contracts. So we extracted text from these PDFs, and then we calculated Gerald Winkler dissimilarity scores, for the whole document and also for particular sections. So, but if you're not familiar with this measure, this is basically tells you with some nuance, it tells you the proportion of characters that are not common to the current collective bargaining agreement and the prior one. So a 0 would be, this is the same document, every single character is in the same spot in the same order. A value of 1 would say there's no character in either of these documents that correspond in terms of order and things like that. Okay, so higher value is more dissimilar. Okay, so this is some just information about what these contracts look like over time. So on the left panel, this is just showing that these contracts are just kind of ballooning in length over time. By 2015, they're about 24,000 words long on average. The right panel now is showing you these Jarrow-Winkler dissimilarity scores. So you can see in the solid line, this is just the contracts overall, the whole text in them. They're becoming slightly more stable over time. And then there's a big jump in 2011, and I'll talk about that briefly. This stability seems to be one of the sections that's becoming more stable and maybe driving this is the sections on salaries and benefits. Okay, so what's going on in 2011? Ohio implemented their race to the top teacher evaluation plan. And so they radically reconstructed the way that teacher evaluations were happening. And as you can see, the sections that dealt with teacher evaluations drastically changed during that time period. And that's a big part of what is changing these contracts. And this isn't the focus of the study, but I show this just to kind of highlight, we are picking up something meaningful in these dissimilarity scores of these different sections. So even though there's going to be lots of noise, problems with scraping and things like that, we are still picking up something meaningful through this exercise that matches with this policy here. Okay, and then we have information like I was mentioning to Marty earlier, we can observe actual contract outcomes. So rather than just who's currently working there and what they're making, we can see the full set of possible salaries based on the number of years of experience at a district and also the education that they have. So this is just a truncated version. This would go down to 14 or 15 years here. And so in our sample here, the lowest paying teachers are earning 25,000 and the highest paying are earning 101,000. These are PhD teachers. So, or no, these are masters. The PhDs are even higher. So there are some districts where it's not very many, but there are some districts where teachers are making a decent amount. But for the most part, they hover around 40 to 70,000, which is kind of maybe more what you'd expect. And there's also other variation that's there to explain and what we try to explain. So every collective bargaining agreement provides health insurance coverage, but like we show here, only 50% provide prescription coverage or optical coverage, 80% dental coverage. And you can see there's lots of different things that these contracts cover that we also have, the number of minutes for meals, sick days, things like that. So there's lots of variation outside of just, in terms of benefits, outside of just do you have health insurance coverage. Okay, so that was some background about collective bargaining. Now we'll turn attention to the tax referenda, how property tax levies work here in Ohio. So like many other states, a large share of the school district resources come from local sources, so 40% here, and these are from property taxes. So in Ohio, in order to raise taxes above a state set millage rate, you need approval from the voters, from the constituents in the area. And so what these districts do is they'll put votes on, they'll introduce referenda typically during the November election. It's by far the most common one. They can issue capital bonds if they want to build a new wing for their school or a new stadium or something like that. They can do that, or they can request a tax levy for operational expenditures. And that's what we focus on in this paper, is these operational expenditures. And 80% of the referenda are these non-bond referenda. About 250 a year are going up across the district. And we spoke earlier about why these are happening so frequently. And I think of it as a feature of the data. Okay, so here's just some information about.
Jason, a quick clarifying question. So you only focus on the non-capital expenditure referenda.
Right. Yep, that's right.
Is there any like do they, or is there any benefit to the districts specifying what they're going to use the money for? Like, do they say, yes, this is sort of general fund referenda, but here's our plan, either like on the ballot or in the public?
Yes.
press?
So Most of the time it's just general. It's just, these are operating expenditures to facilitate general instruction. But there is, and we actually have this information. We haven't used it. This is a great comment. There are times where they'll say we need more staffing or we need X, Y, and Z, and the districts aren't bound. No one's checking that they're spending the money this way, but it is on the ballot, and it does. They can signal what they're hoping to spend it for. For the capital bonds, that one is the funds are actually earmarked. They have to build their stadium. They have to build their wing. But money is fungible, so that could be interesting variation too. But there are we observe what shows up on the ballot, so we could do some sort of text scraping and figuring out whether or not a particular levy was earmarked for something, even if it's not technically earmarked, just if it was
or in the popular press, right? You could scrape sort of the popular press to see how they're talking about it. I mean, the motivation here goes back to what Marty was talking about a while ago, like what are the ways in which the union can influence? It seems at least possible, maybe even plausible to me, that one way that the union could exert influence is by influencing the levy process itself. Like, I know I have a collective bargaining sort of event coming up very soon, so I have sort of influence over the district, and I might, get them to pre-commit to spending it on salaries, and they talk about it in the press, and so more people vote for it, et cetera, et cetera. So it might be interesting to see whether you find effects on that content of to the extent you can measure the promises they're making about how to use the money. It might be interesting to see whether you find effects on that.
Sure, and I mean, we could even just say, does it, and maybe this is what you're proposing, we do these, what's proposed out to the public, does that differ for districts when they're putting something on the ballot that's near an upcoming election relative to ones that have a distant one? And you might see differences in what's being proposed. That's kind of the, that's a great, we haven't done anything with that, and we will do that. Thank you. Okay, excellent point. Okay, so this just gives you some information about some of the tax referenda for the close and distant districts, as we talked about. We focus on this restricted sample. We kind of zoom in, so the restricted sample, we focus on votes that are happening within 15 percentage points of the threshold, and then we also limit it to districts that have on-time collective bargaining schedules. They're on this 3 or 4 year set schedule. And so that's going to be the feature here. And we kind of talked about it earlier, but as you can see, most of the votes are right around 50%, which is what you'd expect. These districts are trying to eke out all of the revenue they can, conditional on trying to pass these things. Okay, so we have school data as well. This is some of this is more common data. We have actually from the Common Core of data. We have financing, staffing, and student data. We also have district level student achievement from the Ohio Department of Education, and then some restricted access measures of student level gains, value added estimates. Even though it's at the district level, these are student level standard deviations. And then we have restricted use data that lets us track teachers over time, so we can see where the teachers are actually moving to between schools. And then we have restricted use budget, 5-year budget forecasts, which the districts need to send to the Department of Education so that they can monitor their fiscal health. And this just gives us a sense of the fiscal health of these districts under these different bargaining pressures. Okay, so let's look at these close and distant school districts in terms of observables based on the schools. So you can see we've done statistical tests for this in the paper that you can look at, but across these different observables, the two types look very similar observably. And this just is kind of building evidence that these two groups are more or less exogenously determined. Whether your district falls into a close or distant CBA, we argue is plausibly randomly assigned. Okay, so now we have another set of results. So we'll talk through how does shaping the contracts change when you have more or less bargaining pressure. We'll talk about how money is spent. We'll talk about how it changes staffing, and then student achievement. So we'll just kind of march through those those results one at a time, and hopefully it won't be just too many graphs and things. I'll try to pause along the way, and then we'll kind of sum up at the end what we've concluded from all of this. Okay, so let's looking at text changes in these contracts. This is these Jarrow-Winkler scores. So to remind you, this is the third column, depending on how you count columns. This final column here tells you if you narrowly pass a tax referenda and you're a close district. So you pass a tax referenda in November and you're scheduled to collectively bargain that upcoming summer. What happens if you just narrowly pass that? And then the column to the left is how different are the districts that are collectively bargaining in the distant future compared to those that are bargaining now. Okay, so what this is saying, the far column is telling you more union pressure, the left column is telling you less union pressure is another way to categorize it. So the districts that get this new influx of resources under more union pressure, they change more of the overall text. So about 1.3% of the text is changed in these overall documents. That is not the case, so that the positive effects here are basically counteracted by the negative here. And so there's basically no effect overall for distant districts, but the text surrounding work conditions is changing. So this could go along with the story of maybe there's less money on the table for these distant districts that are facing less union pressure to negotiate over. And so instead they make concessions based on working conditions and non-monetary parts of the teacher's work experience.
Boy, would it be great to be able to put a direction on that finding, like, is it towards more restrictive or less restrictive? Because the story you told is very plausible, but if all you're measuring is change, right? I mean,
yeah, let me make a note. I mean, I would love to as well. Just based on how hard it was to even just get class.
Yeah. No, I understand.
I mean, the text is there, the data is there. It's just how to extract it. So I need to. I would love to be able to put a sign on that as well. You're absolutely right.
Maybe even just to characterize for a small subset of ones that meet this definition and do some investigation. And then that might generate some more general measurement ideas. I don't know.
That's a great idea. Making a note of this. I'm not writing an email. Okay, great. Okay, excellent. And then in terms of benefit provisions, so districts that have more union pressure, they acquire new benefits for teachers. So this benefit gain count is just the number of the following benefits: dental, prescription drugs, attendance bonus, these following things that have increased. This is just an attempt to help increase our precision. And so districts that are under more pressure, they're just improving benefits for their teachers along these different dimensions. And they also have longer meal times by 5 minutes. So maybe that matters a lot. I'm not sure, but that's something that does show up. And in terms of salaries, so this is what's in the union contracts themselves, not necessarily the composition of teachers at these schools, which is just what shows up in that grid. We have very imprecise estimates here, and they're only significant if we, at conventional levels, if we expand the window, the bandwidth to a larger bandwidth to have some more precision here. So, but the point estimates go in the same direction. It's just we're in that little dip if we look at our first one. So districts that have more union pressure tend to negotiate or tend to pass. Districts passing levies under more union pressure negotiate about $1,000 more for the top level master's degree teachers in the district, and there's really no change for districts that are facing less union pressure. And there's even some at the lower end as well in the wider bandwidth, but it's just not, isn't corroborated by the smaller samples. So we focus more on the evidence seems to be more suggestive that the top end of the distribution is increasing.
All right, you want to jump in?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I had a question about the timing of how you're measuring the timing. Is it just the expiration date of the existing contract, or are you actually looking for when the new contract went into effect? And the reason I ask is that in my experience in New York, these contract expiration dates were really like almost like a fake deadline, in that, the terms of the contract were that people kept working under the terms of the existing contract. And what happened was, eventually when an election was approaching, the mayor would sign a new contract with a big retroactive pay hit for the union, so that the expiration of a contract, since the unions can't strike, doesn't really create any pressure on the politicians. It creates pressure on the unions. And the pressure on the politicians or the people negotiating with the unions is actually created by the election date, not the contract expiration date.
Right. Yeah. So we focus on ones that are on track. So we're using the start date of the new contract for the reasons you mentioned. So I should say, so normally I'm doing all my own stunts when I write papers, but Stefan was doing a lot of the nitty gritty of this. So I need to, and he's not here, so I can't ask him this, unfortunately. I need to check back to make sure that that's absolutely right. But my recollection is that we're using the start date of the impending contract, and we make sure that they're on track. So we don't want contracts that are short if they have like a little stopgap that they need to fill, and or for these reasons like you're saying. But we are paying attention to contracts that have a scheduled date and the start dates are lining up. And so it's just, what we're trying to do is we're trying to find a sample where it just seems like these districts are on a schedule and they just hit it and they meet up every time, and less of the districts where there's more gaming along this timing dimension. But I'll look into that more. I wish I had a more satisfactory answer to you, but that's how we've set it up. Yeah, great question though. Okay, so the takeaways for this is that we have imprecise estimates. We definitely do, but there's a coherent story, we think, being told. The districts that are facing more union pressure are changing more of their contract language overall. They're agreeing to a higher teacher compensation, both in terms of salaries and benefits, where the districts that are facing less union pressure may have provided concessions related to work conditions. But as Marty said, we should, and I mean, this is a big part of the story. So I think it would be worth devoting time and resources trying to figure out the direction of that. So I think that's a great suggestion.
Jason, did I read the prior slide correctly as saying that really you're seeing increases in compensation for more experienced teachers, but not for new teachers?
Exactly.
Or much larger, fivefold.
Exactly.
Okay. The reason I think that's important to sort of, I don't know, you might call it top level compensation or experience compensation for experienced teachers, because I think there's a big difference between raising the pay for the existing crop of teachers versus trying to change teacher pay to attract new teachers in terms of what we would think about the achievement effects. And so I think it'd be worth trying to be precise about that language. Yeah.
That's great. Yes, I wasn't precise here. I think I edited it out. I had top level and then I tried to make it more compact, so I shouldn't have done that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So this is all at the top end of the distribution. And you're right, that tells you things about possibly maybe who the unions are paying attention to. Yeah, that's an important thing. So I'll make sure it's highlighted in future presentations and in the paper. I think that's a great point. Okay, so now we're going to turn to revenues and how these revenues are allocated. So here's four figures here. The left two are a placebo test. We're looking at close districts on the top and distant districts on the bottom. And the outcome is how much money what are your revenues per pupil 3 years before the focal election has happened? So there shouldn't be any impact of passing a levy on your previous revenues if this design works. And that's what we see. And if you look at the year following the election for close and distant districts, you see that they both get an increase of about $500 per pupil in terms of revenues. And it's not different for either one. And we wouldn't expect it necessarily to be different. These are similar districts. They're passing similar type levies. They just happen to be at a different stage when they're going up for collective bargaining. So it makes sense that they get revenue, but it's not necessarily different. Putting those figures in terms of a table, if you look at how revenues are changing 3 years after the levy now, instead of just the first year, if we look out just a little bit longer, districts are spending about $200 more per pupil on current expenses, current expenditures, and there's no real difference in terms of union influence. So this goes along with, like, they get more money, they're spending their money, they're both spending money, and now we're going to dive into a little bit of how they're spending their money, and that's where the differences are really going to show up. And this, maybe we're reading the tea leaves a little bit too much here, but the districts with less union pressure are spending less on instruction, including salaries, and more on support services, but these are really noisy. So let's just drill down, and when we drill down into it a little bit more, we can see things a little bit more precisely. Okay, so drilling down into instructor salary and benefits, the districts that face less union pressure are spending about $50 less per pupil on benefits. And that's consistent with what we saw earlier in the actual contracts. This is now in the finance files. So we're kind of seeing a similar type pattern here. And then if we look at the reserves, so this is that restricted data that we have that shows their 5-year forecasts of their fiscal health. So districts with more union pressure are spending down their reserves faster. So they're spending down their reserves faster than the ones with less union pressure. And this is consistent with the notion that these districts that are facing union pressure maybe are allocating the resources in ways that maybe push on them a little bit more than they can handle at the time. Just puts a little bit extra fiscal stress on these districts. And then in terms of staffing, if we just look at who's working at these schools and how does that affect student-teacher ratios, the districts with less union pressure, this looks like where they're spending their money when they are able to allocate their resources relatively free of union pressure. They just hire more teachers, and that brings down student-teacher ratios as a result. But you don't see that for the districts that have more union pressure. So we look at the final set of outcomes here is student achievement, and this is kind of how do all of these things impact the efficiency of these schools. It's the same exercise on the left. This is showing for close and distant districts what happens 3 years before the focal election, so there should be nothing. And then 3 years after, the close ones, these are the ones facing union pressure. It's basically 0. There's no change in student achievement. But the districts that face an increase, or that face union pressure when they allocate their resources, experience an increase in student level achievement. So the full estimates here. So the districts with less union pressure are increasing their student achievement by about 0.15 to 0.2 district level standard deviations. If you put this in terms of student level standard deviation gains, it's about a 0.02 standard deviation gain. And this is on the higher end of estimates that estimate the returns to spending in the literature, but still within the range that's found. It's just on the higher end here. Okay, so that was a lot. So let's just kind of recap the different set of results here, and then we'll actually conclude about on time. That's great. So we've categorized districts as districts we think will be experiencing more or less union influence, and the ones that are experiencing more influence, we find that, oh, there we go, Marty. So I have at least I have top level at once in here. So they negotiate higher top level teacher salaries by $1,000. There's increases in some benefit, dental coverage, prescription coverage, and the like. They spend down their reserves faster than districts with less union pressure. And we don't see any staffing or achievement effects in these districts. But districts that are allocating these extra resources under less union pressure, they don't see any salary increases or benefit gains. They change the text related to work conditions more. And we see that the teacher counts in these schools go up, student-teacher ratios go down, and as a result, student test scores go up. And sorry. And so the overall takeaway is that we do have imprecise estimates, but all of the results seem to be telling a coherent story and pointing in the same direction, and that direction appears to be that there are some efficiency losses that occur from collective bargaining. Okay, and that's all I have. Thank you for your time.
Great, Jason, thanks so much. That gives us a lot to chew on, and we have a couple minutes for discussion. Eric, you had your hand up a moment ago, but I'd encourage others to jump in as well.
Very small thing, so I'll let others.
Michael.
So I'm curious, maybe this is just some advice in terms of framing the paper, but or expanding on your research agenda going forward. But it seems to me that this is very relevant to what we're witnessing around the country right now. If you've seen some of Marguerite Rose's work suggesting that districts that have remained fully remote and have not reopened are sitting on budget surpluses in comparison to districts that have gone back, and then you add into the equation all of this federal money that's about to come to districts. So I'm curious what maybe we can learn from your study here in terms of what to anticipate about how districts are going to be spending a lot of the new federal resources they're going to get, and maybe how you might think about going about studying that using kind of the framework that you've used here.
Yeah, this is a great comment. I'm not sure how I would study it. I mean, with the framework here, we're just using these referenda, which I don't think would get at this variation you're explaining, but I think it's a very interesting variation. Yeah, I think, and it's hard to say too, because I just feel like the pandemic has just kind of blown everything up, and it's just, we're in a whole new world here. I think if there was business as usual in the past, it does seem like districts themselves value having more teachers and having smaller class sizes, and that seems to be something that when they have money that they can allocate their funding that way, that's what they would like to do, at least in terms of the operation expenditures. We're not talking about bonds and things. Maybe the districts would really like to have nice new shiny buildings and things like that as well. We can't really say about that, but I would say if the world went back to what it used to be, and districts had budget surpluses that they could allocate how they would like, I think the data from this paper and the results suggest that they would like to have smaller classes and have more teachers to be working with. But again, like I said, we're in a new world here, and so maybe post-COVID there will be different things. Maybe it will be a shift to having better classes, better ventilation, and that's really where both district officials and teachers unions are kind of seeing on the same page. So it's really hard to say just because everything's kind of been shifted. But I do think that's a great way of framing the paper and the importance of how do these districts allocate money in or out of union, the presence of union strength. So thank you. That's a great comment.
There's another possible answer to that question. It's a very interesting question from Michael, that districts are going to have much more flexibility if they're not going through contract negotiations right now, and that your advice to them would be to try to put that off if the institutional setting allows them to as well. Just another thought.
Right. Yeah. Especially navigating this new world we're in, having that flexibility could be particularly helpful. Yeah, I agree.
I have a question about the capital bonds that you didn't use. Given that you're trying to, I don't know, tell a story with multiple estimates that are not quite at the precision that you would want to, but all point in the same direction. Every additional sort of thing you can point to helps. And so it seems to me that if your logic is right, that union strength shouldn't matter with respect to any consequences of the capital expenditures, because you said they're sort of prescribed in their use in the document itself. And so I wondered if those could serve as a placebo type test of some point. I don't know what outcomes you would want to use them for, but that would probably be a very underpowered analysis itself. But
it would fit right in with all of our other
just anything that you're trying to assemble a lot of consistent evidence here. So
right. Yeah, that's a great point. And I guess it would just be to the extent that we don't think the money is fungible. But I need to look at what share of it would be fungible to the degree that operating expenditures are being diverted to these kind of capital projects. And maybe when you pass a capital levy, or capital bond, I need to check. You probably are baking in like upkeep for the new infrastructure and things like that. That's a great point. That could be a great placebo if there's not these fungibility concerns.
Ira.
Yeah, well, I mean, whenever you try to get a bond issue passed, the big advocates for it are the construction unions who are going to build the buildings and the investment bankers who are going to get the fees from the bond offerings. So it may not be that there's no union power there. It may just be a different sector of labor movement.
That's a fair point.
Can I add just one other quick suggestion?
Yeah, please.
I don't know that you would, I think this would help your power. It's a little bit of a different way of getting at this than looking at the bond election so much. But if you want to sort of extend this into thinking about the way in which the political incentives set up to spend money or not, you might think about doing something like what Steve Levitt did with gubernatorial election cycles and spending, and taking advantage of the fact that I would assume this would be exogenous, the years in which a board has a majority of members up for election, which should be somewhat random if you have a 5-member board. Some years it'll be 3, some years it'll be 2. Maybe that's underpowered to find anything, the difference between the majority versus not. These aren't US Senate seats that are coveted, but on the other hand, that's something that would be easy to get, and you could at least sort of interact that and see if that matters.
Thank you. Yeah, I made a note of that just now. Thank you.
All right, so I guess we are a couple minutes past time, and I know that people have other obligations to go to. So let me just close briefly by thanking Jason again. And I'm sure you would welcome additional comments and follow up however people want to reach you.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care, Jason. Thanks everyone for being here.
Take care.